Okay guys, in this clip let's finish up the anatomy of the male reproductive system, and then we'll start in on the anatomy of the female reproductive system. So yesterday we talked about spermatogenesis and the physiology of the male reproductive system, and we get to this point here now we're talking about the external genitalia. Now in males the external genitalia includes the penis and the scrotum, and you can see those in the figure there. The penis is a tubular organ, and the penis of course has the urethra that passes through it. So the penis is going to have two functions: one, to conduct the urine to the outside of the body from the urinary system, from the bladder, and two, to conduct the semen outside of the body and deposit it into the female's vagina during reproduction. So the movement of urine and the movement of semen is the main role for the penis. The scrotum is an external sac that lies outside of the body, and a lot of people ask, why would the testicles, which are the gonads, so an important structure, be located outside of the body instead of inside where it could be protected? And the reason why is because sperm develop at a lower temperature than normal body temperature, so it would be very difficult to cool anything that's inside the body. So the way evolution has worked is the testicles have evolved to come outside of the body. So sperm are developed at a temperature 1 to 3 degrees lower than the rest of the body temperature, and by having the testes outside the body, it allows sperm to develop at that temperature where they're most effective. So hence the gonads being on the outside of the body. Now a penis, in order to carry out its function of delivering sperm into the vagina, it needs to become erect. And an erection is when we have an enlargement and stiffening of the penis, and the reason that happens is because the penis has a lot of spongy erectile tissue, and this spongy tissue, when a person becomes aroused, it fills up with blood. And you can see on the picture here, there's lots of arteries, there's lots of veins, so blood can move into the penis during stimulation, and that causes the penis to become erect, which allows it to enter the female reproductive tract. Now the sperm needs to travel from the male reproductive system into the female reproductive system. So the term for the sperm moving through the urethra is called ejaculation. Okay, and ejaculation is the powerful release of semen from the urethra to the exterior inside the female's vagina. It's a sympathetic reflex, so it happens with those involuntary movements of peristaltic muscle contractions, and it causes the sphincter at the base of the urinary bladder to close so that urine can't escape during ejaculation. So only semen is moved through the urethra at that time. So here's a last look at the male reproductive structure. Hopefully you guys can identify all of the tissues and all of the glands and all of the structures that are pointed out in this picture as a review. Okay, so next we're going to move and we're going to start talking about the female reproductive system. So for the first little while we'll talk about anatomy, and then we'll move into the physiology. So the female reproductive system is made up of the ovaries, which are the gonads, so those are the structures that are going to produce the sex cells, in this case the eggs. We have uterine or fallopian tubes, or sometimes called oviducts. So uterine tubes, fallopian tubes, or oviducts are all the same structure. We have the uterus, we have the vagina, and finally we have the mammary glands. The mammary glands can also be considered part of the integumentary system, but for this part we'll talk about it as a part of the reproductive system. So, as I mentioned, the ovaries are the female gonads, so they're paired, and they're located on the posterior surface of the abdominal wall. And we'll show you some anatomical pictures of those in a second. And they produce the sex hormones, which are primarily estrogen and progesterone, and those are going to have a major role to play in the reproductive cycle of the female, as well as development of structures, maintenance of pregnancy. The list goes on and on. So estrogen and progesterone are very, very important hormones when we talk about females. Ovaries are also responsible for the production of the female gamete. So often you'll hear it called an egg, an oocyte, or an ovum. Those are all going to be the female gamete, which is going to be the egg. So here's a look at just the female reproductive system. We can see the position of the ovaries. We can see the fallopian tube or the oviducts. Um, Typically, once a month, one ovary releases one oocyte or one egg. Okay, that egg will travel from the ovaries. It'll be collected into the fallopian tubes, and it'll move down into a structure called the uterus. The uterus is a super dynamic structure, and we'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. Finally, the vagina is a short passageway that connects the uterus to the exterior of the body. Now, the fallopian tubes they're paired, so there's one coming from each ovary. Once the oocyte is released from the ovary, it's collected into the fallopian tube by a bunch of cilia movement. And the fallopian tubes are the site of fertilization. So if an egg is released and it's in the fallopian tubes, this is where the sperm will meet the egg and will fertilize the egg and become a developing embryo. The fallopian tubes are the structures that are going to transport the oocyte to the uterus. So the oocyte or the ovary, or the egg is produced in the ovary. It's released from the ovary. It's collected into the fallopian tube, and the fallopian tube carries that egg into the uterus. So you can see a couple of different planes showing the female reproductive structure here. So up here we have the ovary. The circled part is the fallopian tube. This part here is going to be the uterus, and then we have the vagina down here. So we got the same structures over here on the other side, but we're looking at it from a different angle. Now, the uterus is also called the womb, and it's a very dynamic, which means changing structure. Okay, it undergoes changes quite often. It has a lining around the inside of it called the endometrium, and every month, every menstrual cycle, the endometrium thickens and thins to prepare for a possible pregnancy or the implantation of an embryo. If this doesn't happen, then the endometrium is shed, so it's not held on, it's released. And then, of course, the menstruation cycle comes, the endometrium leaves through the cervix and through the vagina, and then the menstrual cycle will begin again. And we'll talk about those cycles a little bit later in this unit. Now, the uterus is fairly small by size-wise. It's about 7 centimeters long, and then by 4 to 5 centimeters wide. So it's quite small, but it's got the potential to change shape incredibly. So the uterus, of course, is where the embryo will develop into a fetus and eventually into a full-term baby. And you know yourself, some of these babies can be quite big. 4 kilograms is not unheard of. That's a fairly large baby, but you can get even bigger than that. So the uterus can go from a very small structure to quite a big structure, and its importance is absolutely amazing. So here's a look at the position of the uterus in the female body, and that's from a couple of different angles. Now, the vagina is a short passageway that connects the uterus to the exterior of the body. When you compare it to the uterus, the vagina is quite thin-walled, and the function of the vagina is it's the entry point for sperm and penis during intercourse, and it's the exit point. So this is also called the birth canal. When the baby's fully developed, this is where the baby will leave the female's body, and it's also where menstrual flow will leave if there's no conception, if fertilization hasn't occurred and the menstrual or endometrium is shed. And of course, here's another look at where the vagina is positioned on the female. Now, the cervix is an important structure. It's a muscular band, and it's a separation basically between the uterus and the vagina. So at the point where the uterus becomes the vagina, or the vagina and the uterus come together, we get a muscular band of tissue that we call the cervix. And it's basically, during child development, it'll hold the baby inside the uterus. When the baby is ready to be born, the cervix will relax, it'll open, and that'll allow the baby to move from the uterus into the vagina and, of course, outside the body. Now, unlike the male, the female reproductive system and urinary system have separate openings. So the male has the urethra, which is involved in both the reproductive system and the urinary system. For the female, that's not true. There's separate exits for each one. The urethra is separate from the vagina, and these exits are going to be covered externally by these tiny skin folds. You'll have a thinner inner fold that are called the labia minora, and then outside of that you'll have a thicker outer one that are called the labia majora. So here's a look at the position of the labia minora and the labia majora. One more structure that's located close to that area is called the clitoris, and the clitoris is a small amount of erectile tissue, so it's similar physiologically as the penis. It can become erect, so it'll fill with blood and enlarge, and it has a role to play during intercourse and during sexual stimulation. Now, the area between that is covered or surrounded by the labia minora is called the vestibule, and inside that area you're going to have the openings to the vagina, of course, which is part of the reproductive system, and the urethra, which is part of the urinary system. So the vestibule is the space, and it's surrounded by the labia minora, and then inside the vestibule, inside that space, you're going to have the opening for the urethra as well as the vagina. Above that, we're going to have a pad of fat, and you're going to find this in both males and females, and it's a pad of fat that occurs on top of the pubic symphysis, or the pubic bone. So it adds a layer of protection for the bone. We don't want to have the bone be subject to external forces or punishment or anything like that. So we add this layer here called the mons pubis, and it's a layer of padding basically to protect the pubic bone, which is just above the reproductive structures for both males and females. Another structure that are in common between both male and female is the perineum, and the perineum is basically the pelvic floor. So if we look at it in males, the perineum goes from the anus to the base of the scrotum, and if we look at it in females, it goes from the anus to the labia. One more structure that we see in the female reproductive system are the mammary glands, and the mammary glands are exocrine glands. They're modified sweat glands, which is why they're sometimes talked about in the integumentary system, but they're in the female mammal, and they produce milk, which nourishes the young. Mammary glands are unique to mammals, so there's a classification of mammals, and there's only a certain set of animals that have these mammary glands, and they're unique in that they nurse their young. So if you think about whales, humans, horses, cows, these are all mammals, and they have mammary glands, and they nurse their young. Now, mammary glands, the growth or development of mammary glands are controlled by hormones. Both males and females have mammary glands, but as I'm sure you're aware, the male mammary glands are not very well developed whatsoever. And the reason why is because the male hormone, testosterone, stops the development of mammary glands. Whereas in the female, the estrogen will develop those mammary glands and allow them to become fully functional. So even though in the males they're basics, in females, they'll be rudimentary and basic until puberty, when the level of estrogen goes up. That's when mammary gland development will occur, and that's because of increased levels of estrogen in the female and increased levels of testosterone in the male, which prevents the development of the mammary glands.